very interesting conversation where we have HR conversations with non-HR folk. And I think in the last 12 months to 18 months, we've seen an increase in the need for the employee experience and for HR teams to really start adopting digital solutions, adopting processes that are much more personalized, much more, I would say, productive from an organization perspective. And so the whole point of this conversation will be to try and understand from experts in other fields on what we could possibly learn and bring into the HR spectrum as well. And so, with that, I'd like to welcome Guneet Singh, who is the head of marketing and creative services at Google. Guneet, welcome, and thank you so much for taking the time.
Oh, thanks, Kiran. Thanks for inviting me. It's a very interesting space that we're going to have a conversation today about.
Have
I
you
don't know if
had?
I have. I don't know if I, in all the previous organizations that I've worked in, ever had a conversation on, hey, what do I do which can translate to what my HR team does? So
Yeah.
it's definitely an interesting space of conversation.
Have you thought about it as a people leader yourself? Have you thought about what could possibly be done?
I fundamentally always think about the fact that even for marketing, right? And when I get a bunch of new folks or people fresh from campus who basically read Kotler and jumped into marketing. My fundamental thing to everybody is to have empathy for the person that you're trying to deliver a certain value to.
Right.
For me, that underscore fundamental doesn't change. Whether it's a shampoo, whether it's Gmail,
Right.
or whether it's an employee. So if you really find the ability to have that empathy and for the person you're trying to create value to, and you know that you're attempting to create value and service for that recipient, I think that's a good starting point to be with.
And I guess, in your 17 years plus of work experience from a marketing perspective, what do you think, if I were to ask you just a quick question on what do you think CX or customer experience is all about?
First, it's 20 years, so I've grayed a little
20
bit more
years.
for the
Excellent.
last. It could be that due to COVID, those years passed by very quickly. But yes, I think if I look back, and I just to simplify this, right, for everybody, I think CX is really about whether you'll get the second date or not. Really, if I was to sort of bring this down, it's really as simple as that. But on a slightly serious note, I think CX for me really comprises of two elements.
Yeah.
Most people end up focusing on the first one, which is the feelings I have today after consuming or experiencing the services or the products that I'm getting. And most people tend to focus on that. But I think there's the end impact of this experience or the feelings that I have, which leads to my future perceptions and action, is actually a bigger component. And I think the collective of what my experience and feelings today and what they possibly lead to in future as my perception and my actions is what customer experience is all about.
And so, what would the fundamentals of being a CX leader mean or providing the best possible customer experience?
Like I said, it starts, I mentioned earlier, it's about empathy.
Okay.
It's about the empathy of the recipient of your product or service and the person that you're trying to create value for. Now, that's a big word, and it often has multiple layers as you peel through it. So if I were to try and peel it, I'd actually think it's around 3-4 things. The first starts with discovery, right? So do you
Yep.
really understand and know really, really well what that recipient of your product or service needs? And that discovery is a very, very critical and core to the entire process that I would say of the CX piece.
Right.
The second would be to actually develop. So post discovery, how do you go about developing the right product or service offering, which
Okay.
will create value for that person? After the developer of the product or service is the delivery. So
Yep.
in what form, at what moment is that service or product being delivered? And I think these three fundamentally are the most critical components of defining what goes into a CX.
Okay.
Very often, people don't focus on the fourth one, which I often call out, which is the consumption experience.
Okay.
Right. So you've done the discovery, you've built the product, you have delivered it,
Yeah.
but have you focused on the consumption experience and the, like I said, the future focused element of what is the perceptual residual perception that's left, or the
Right.
future positive action that will happen because of this entire discovery, development, and delivery that you've created. And
Got
so
it.
there are four components, if I was to think of it, which is discover, develop, deliver, and consume.
How do you kind of get started from that perspective? I mean, are there certain personas that you're creating and then kind of doing this for each one of those personas from a customer experience perspective? Or are there certain data points that you start off with? How do you kind of get started on this process?
A lot depends upon where you're starting off and for what product or service you're starting off for. Is that you can figure out, which is, if I was to translate that into the world of HR, could possibly be the public source data, career professional data that's available. That's a great starting point.
Right.
And that's possibly the easiest and I would say the lowest effort, but also
Yep.
the shallowest, if I would say, in its effectiveness to create a great experience later on. Followed by that is actually a lot more personal and specific, data, which is stated.
Okay.
And so this is possibly things that you can ask in a questionnaire, which you might not find on LinkedIn. Hey, are you married? Do you have kids?
Right.
And those are things that might not show up in a public profile, especially if you're looking only at professional platforms like say
Right.
LinkedIn or so on. Though you can find a lot of this on Facebook if you really start stalking someone. So I won't get there. I don't want HR folks to become employee stalkers. That's not a good trajectory for this conversation. Um, but that's possibly the second bit, which is more about stated personal information.
Yeah.
I really think, however, the richest experiences are drawn from the non-stated behaviors and actions that we can track.
Okay.
And that really forms, I would say, the holy grail of creating experiences. And that's where I would sort of then look at data, because
Yeah.
those are micro moments that are happening. Uh, those exist today, thankfully, in multiple places which are captured digitally.
Yeah.
And I'm not talking about just the glorified worlds of technology firms like ours, but also the everyday transactions that people go through in any sort of place, including manufacturing firms and so on. So how do you pick up on those data crumbs, so to say, which are really unstated everyday actions and behaviors, and then use that to possibly create personas?
Got it.
Because it will become difficult for anybody to be able to manage a million different
Yeah.
individuals
Yeah.
unless until your product delivery becomes that customized. Having said that, I don't want to leave us in the world of marketing which was 15 years ago, which is where I often say, CPG companies will do a research of 1,000 respondents,
Right.
extrapolate those 1,000 respondents to 30 million consumers. Then a research firm will come and make a 2 by 2 grid and four personas in that. And you decide to choose one persona and make a TV ad and you go to market around that. That used to exist in a certain point of time. And it's still fair for that world which cannot get more granular.
Sure.
But when you shift it, for example, to the digital world and what we do today, right? We have the ability to get to a very, very specific individual level,
Mhm.
not just from understanding what that individual wants, but also to then deliver a very customized, unique, value proposition to them.
Got it.
And that really is where the entire trajectory of movement for experience has happened over a period of time. So, and we often call that word, the taxonomy that's very widely used for that is mass personalization.
Yeah.
So we are getting to be personalized, but it's no longer personalization for 5 people, 15 people, or 30 people. It's not just what, say, Mercedes could do in India, but it's what maybe a Maruti could do in India,
Right.
to just put a scale there. So, right, if somebody's selling 5,000 cars versus somebody else selling 5 million cars, can you still offer personalized experiences? And yes, you can, if you choose to.
And so, as an individual who's been part of large enterprises, Google being one of the most well-known brands globally, um, what do you think are some of those unstated data points as an employee, as an individual within the organization? In your mind, what are some of those unstated data points? Because yeah, like you said, form data, things that people are willing to give you or have to give you during when they're joining you, and those kind of things are pretty standard. But what are those unstated kind of data points that you feel, organizations could pick up on a lot more?
I think I'm going to rewind back a couple of steps before I get to the unstated part. And the
Yeah.
reason I'm going to do that is because very often in our world of micro outsourcing that most companies get into,
Yeah.
the HR folks end up believing that they're responsible only for compensation and
Right. Yeah.
vacation policies and work time policies, etc. Well, that could be right from your sphere of influence or direct
Sure.
impact and influence, but that's how an employee sees it.
Sure.
Because if an employee has a lousy experience with an outsourced, cab company which you've put in place, or
Yeah.
an employee has a bad experience with an outsourced insurance help desk that you've put, those are not going to go to that insurance help desk or to that car company. They will finally rattle up to you as an owner. And for brand managers, when we look at the world of marketing,
Right.
that's one big learning. You cannot just, if you're a brand manager at Samsung, you can't just say, hey, I've sold my refrigerator, and that's it, my job is done.
Correct.
Because when tomorrow there's an after sales complaint that gets done on the refrigerator, and that's a separate team altogether,
Yeah.
and they screw up, uh, hey, well, you know what? Your refrigerator has gone down the line for all the fancy segmentation, messaging, mass personalization that you might have attempted to
Correct.
do in the pre-purchase and purchase cycle. The
Yeah.
post-purchase will unwind all of that.
Yeah.
But the reason I was saying that is when you talked about organizations and the data points they have, I think the amount of data points that exist within the work environment can be mind-boggling.
Right.
We spend half our lives at work.
Correct.
Assuming I'm not espousing for bad work-life balance, let's say one third of our lives at work. So if you think of that, uh, and if I look at the engagements, I would have very tactically with just a bunch of outsourced teams, right? I might
Mhm.
have an engagement with insurance help desk, like I
Yep.
mentioned, travel desk, uh, a separate possibly logistics, which is for cabs and more
Yep.
like road transport desk. I could have another one which is say a medical room. Again, those are
Yep.
outsourced all the time. I
Yep.
could have an experience the fitness center,
Yeah.
which I
Wellness
could have in
centers.
wellness
All of it. Yeah.
centers, right?
Yep.
And these are just some of the few ones. They're all so-called H. Some of them at least are all HR perks
Right.
as they're being offered.
Exactly.
I don't know if today there are systems that we are able to bring together those experiences back
Yep.
into a common place for someone to create to make sure that the employee experience is right. And all of them are data experiences.
Correct.
If I manage to if my health report is showing something, and I am or I'm checking on something with the fitness or wellness sort of support that I have, is that information laddered back somewhere?
Correct.
If I have concerns, maybe I'm asking for an incremental insurance cover
Yeah.
beyond what the corporate policy is. And that's a conversation that's happening directly with the insurance desk, or I'm making a transaction to be able to enable that.
Yeah.
Is that information that's something that can be bought in and be useful to create a personalized experience for my employee? So
Correct.
there are all of these. And because of the lack of ownership, like I said, the Samsung brand manager has to own it end to end.
Yeah.
Similarly, a real HR resource somewhere who's looking at the end-to-end benefits for their employees will have to look at it this in entirety.
Correct.
I'll give you a very small example. It's very tactical, so might sound
Sure.
petty,
Sure.
but for someone who traveled almost 15 days a month because of work, you'll understand the complication that it creates. So in
Yeah.
an organization I used to work in earlier, my travel desk was smart enough that when I used to book a ticket, they would book cabs, which from my house to the airport, airport to hotel,
Nice.
back from
Yep.
hotel to airport and airport to home. So there's four
Yep.
four cab trips, so called, that were booked automatically, unless until I chose to opt out.
Yep.
Right. So it was they're done by default unless until you believe you have some other arrangements for transport and you can opt out of it.
Sure.
Compare that to a different travel experience where there are two service providers. Let's say there's Amex and there is, possibly on the travel desk, and let's say there's Avis on the road transport. Both incredible organizations in their respective fields, but they're not necessarily talking to each other.
Correct. Yeah.
Or a person who's making this travel, that's at least 4 cab bookings that have to be provided individually. This is my flight time. This is my airport terminal. This is my pickup address. This is my drop address.
Yep.
Uh,
Yeah.
and now multiply that for somebody who's doing possibly 5 trips a month. and
Yeah.
you have 20 engagements that are being created.
Right.
Uh, and that is bad experience.
It is.
But this
Sure.
is what makes a difference to employees. And I would, for example, when I was in the first organization, I never realized the value of it, but I realized the value of it when I got to the second organization. Because I realized that I had to, for example, a month raise 20 requests on a cab
Oh,
company.
oh,
And every time, because they at their backend did not have the intelligence to recall the, use the employee profile, the employee address, which is so-called stated and captured information. You
yeah.
had to rewind and give that information all over again every time.
Oh my God. Yeah.
So you can imagine, right, how what that means and
Yeah.
from my perspective, that's loss of productivity for me because I'm wasting time just doing that. So it's not just a stress that's being created for the employee, but it's actually loss of productivity for the organization
Right.
when they're doing these transactional elements which are have to be managed. So this
Correct.
is just a small example, but this data, if it was managed well, could also be a great sense of saying, hey, when does this person end up taking most flights? Because you can make out from that trend line, are people taking like 6 a.m. flights or 9 a.m. flights, or are they
Yep.
taking 8 p.m. flights? And that could tell you a lot about the employee, and you could correlate that with, hey, do they have kids? Do they not have kids?
Correct.
Do they have maybe family somewhere else? And those pieces of information could be used to then create a lot more personalized journeys.
Some of the other things that we see actually very similar is when we started kind of deploying from an onboarding perspective, what we realized is that just if you look at onboarding of a new hire, maybe only about 30-35% of the activities were actually HR from an onboarding perspective. 40% was IT, then there's admin, there's operations, there's so many others who have to kind of come together from a data sharing perspective to make sure that I have the best experience, right? So it's actually how do you get that data across each one so that everyone is aligned to make sure that each individual has that best possible experience, right? So I think that also kind of holds true because I think from a CX perspective, and again, this is what I would assume is that you're basically picking up data from multiple touch points as well. It's not just your marketing tools that are giving you the data points, right? It's multiple other tools, systems, processes that are also feeding in data to deliver that experience as well. So I think I completely kind of resonate with that and really rings true. But from an EX perspective, um, do you think that today EX is at a stage where CX is at? Are employees expecting, wanting, hoping for an experience which is similar to their consumer experiences?
I think there are two elements in this. One, which markets are you operating in, right?
Right.
And it's always a matter of demand and supply.
Sure.
So, and I think fundamentally those economics principles don't change whether you're selling a refrigerator or you're hiring an engineer,
Yeah.
right? So if there's enough supply and there is little demand,
Yeah.
you can choose to be lax. So if there's
Right.
there's there's one manufacturer who's making cars in the country and everybody else is just practically non-existent, hey, you can get away with lousy service. You can get away with, you know, car panels where, even on the delivery of the fresh new car, it's creaking when you open the door and you shut the door. You can get away with all that because there's no choice.
Yeah.
And but when talent gets scarce, and we are seeing that, in markets like India and a lot of developing nations, which used to be
Yeah.
earlier considered to be talent surplus,
Correct.
we are seeing talent deficiencies and talent scarcities coming up. This will automatically start rising up to be a critical um, sort of lever that needs to be considered.
Yeah.
The other thing really is just, I would say, which I don't know how often folks in HR look at consumer behavior, meta trends, which is when you look at generational trends that happen between consumers, and
Yeah.
that reflects on people and largely the socioeconomic exposure they've had as they're growing up,
Sure.
and not necessarily whether they were at an X college or a Y institute or a Z organization before that.
Right.
But the generation that's coming up now has, I would say, across markets, has a lot more impatient.
Yep.
And that's because the service ecosystem and product ecosystem outside of their employment is now appealing to that impatience and making sure that they're gratified quickly enough.
Right.
Now, if I expect instant gratification of the work on my, say, on my personal stock exchange, personal stock front, I would expect something similar from my insurance help desk too.
Correct.
In
Yeah.
fact, something better, because my stockbroker might be catering to 1 million users.
Correct.
My insurance help desk is possibly catering to 1,000 users.
Yeah.
And if so, I would expect my expectation level fundamentally has been raised so high that if this is not still keeping the same level as earlier or marginally improved, in net reality for me as a user, it's gone down.
Mm-hmm.
So that impatience in our generation is very high. Now, this also shows in terms of things like job happiness, right? And
I like
therefore,
that.
that starts.
Happiness. That's
It
a
is. I mean, that's when I look at CVs, for example, that
yeah.
come to me,
Yeah.
I actually look at that because in my mind, there is just like I would think for a brand, there are consumers who are loyalists and
Yep.
there are consumers who are experimentalists,
Correct.
right?
Of
It's
course.
very difficult to change an experimentalist's behavior unless until there's a very clear intervention that you're able to do on a need state and value equation.
Okay.
They will continue to experiment, whether they start at 20 and finish at 40 or 60, but they will continue to experiment. Whereas those who are loyal would possibly experiment a couple of times and become loyal.
Right.
If you see a high trend of happiness,
Mm-hmm.
it is going to be difficult to retain that employee
Yep.
unless until you are consciously aware about it and you're making conscious intentional choices because you think that talent is worth it.
Yep.
I'm not saying it's impossible to do, but it has to be very intentional ways of being able to do that. And people who are ideally the first line of manager and maybe the team HR resource who's mapped to
Mm-hmm.
that team both have to be very intentional about saying, hey, this person, great talent, however happy in nature, we will need to make intentional measures to retain this talent.
Got it. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think that part of it is the second reason I would say as you're thinking of whether the CX is whether EX is as coming up to where CX is and it's all as important. Well, it needs to be as important
Right.
because the dynamics in which it's operating has changed,
Yeah.
both
Absolutely.
both from the consumer perspective as well as just the market economics perspective.
Correct. Yeah. I mean, we're seeing that every day from the market as well. Is that I think everyone is struggling with the kind of so-called talent war that's kind of happening, and it's not just as you said in India, right? It's specifically in industries that are fast-moving, technology industries, financial, pharma. All of them are kind of facing the same problem across the board. But Guneet, as a people leader and as a CX leader, what are some of the things you do which are non-HR kind of related, but for your teams using some of your learnings?
I think the first thing which I often lament because I can do
Yeah,
that for a customer I don't know, but I struggle to see that for an employee in my team, and this is across organizations, not just my current organization.
sure.
See, when you're a direct line manager, getting to know your new teammates is a lot more easier.
Right.
But when you're a manager of managers, you're already an arm's away,
Correct.
and the
Correct.
amount of time you can spend with a new onboardee becomes restricted.
Of course.
Their
Yeah.
expectation of the experience from you doesn't. For that person, for that employee,
Yeah.
their expectation hasn't reduced just because you're a manager of a manager, right? They
Correct.
still and they actually expect more from you
Yeah. Yeah.
being your senior leader, but your understanding of that person is would be much far away. So the fact that you could have a leisurely 1 hour onboarding conversation, figure out everything about their background, the unstated non-professional CV information,
Right.
kids, family, what's been their upbringing, and start therefore in your mind creating labels which
Yep.
will help you create a more personalized journey. I would love to have a dossier like that which comes up in front of me when I'm meeting a new employee. Doesn't
Got it.
exist.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like nobody bothers to put it up. Um, and I don't know. You definitely might work with a lot many more organizations. I don't know if they bother to do that. I can obviously ask for it, right? So
Yeah. Yeah.
I can make an intentional ask to my manager to say, hey, you obviously recruited this person.
Yeah.
Let me know. Let me read the notes. Let me sort of go through the profile. So it's not that the information doesn't exist,
Yeah.
but is it, again, I'll go back to the instant gratification and slightly predictive nature of what we expect nowadays.
Yeah.
It's not there in that space.
It isn't.
Right?
Yeah.
In the
You're right.
life around me, I'm seeing prediction, right? There is the fact that I am consuming something on my card gives me a predictive, hey, you bought this, do you want a service
Yep.
agreement on top of it? That's a predictive piece that you'll see happening using so-called data. But
Yeah.
that predictive piece is helpful because I don't need to go worry about getting an insurance plan. Somebody's realized that I've bought something, I need an insurance plan, and they're giving me an offer up front without me having to take cognitive effort.
Yeah.
We haven't yet moved, I think, very seamlessly from physical effort to cognitive effort and measuring the latter.
Makes sense.
And for a lot of the white collar environments that we operate in, cognitive effort is huge. And I would also say many marketers also don't consider that as a big thing.
Right.
Cognitive effort is a huge player in helping what experience gets created.
Why is that though? Why is it that it's not top of mind then? Something that everyone.
It's very tough to measure.
Okay.
If I was to try and measure cognitive effort, it's very tough. I'll give you an example. And this is again a very sort of consumer simple example,
Sure. Sure.
right? Um, would you like to know how you're going from a place A to place B? Yes. If I was to ask somebody, maybe possibly 10 years or 15 years ago,
Hmm.
that do you want to go? I want to go from place A to place B. They would possibly give me directions in detail. I would figure them out
Right.
and be actively involved in
Yeah.
figuring out what's the best way to reach from place A to place B.
Correct.
Once you had things like Google Maps come in,
Yeah.
you have seamlessly moved. You no longer sort of check on anybody with anything,
Correct.
right? You don't even give a
Correct.
bother.
Yeah.
Google Maps tells you this is the ideal time to leave office
Yeah.
because you will find lowest amount of traffic at this time. Um, Great, you just follow it.
Yeah. Yeah.
What you've
Absolutely.
done is that fundamental behavioral change that's happened in you. You didn't do it knowingly, but
Right.
somewhere there was cognitive effort that was being created for you to find the directions, think of all the times that you've traveled and whether it took 33 minutes or 43 minutes or 67 minutes, and
Yeah.
triangulate and trendline and say, okay, 5:35 is the best time for me to leave office, and on Fridays it should actually be maybe 4:17, whatever,
Yeah.
right? So all of that work was a lot of cognitive effort,
It is. It is.
but it's now being done seamlessly by someone else, and you've given up into that control. Even if it tells you wrong information, and Google doesn't tell you wrong information, let me give you that caveat, but you will follow it
You will.
because
Yes.
you will
Yeah.
not put the effort of going and rechecking that unless
Yeah.
until you have a really poor experience sometime. You will
Correct.
just blindly follow it. So if maps tell you leave at 5:47, you will leave at 5:47.
Correct. Yeah. Absolutely. And if it says, "Hey, I'm rerouting because there's more traffic down this path," you're just gonna do that, right? You're not
Exactly.
gonna
You see how
think.
easily you accept that
Yeah.
decision because it's taken away the cognitive effort from you in a
Right.
credible manner. It
Yeah.
has credibility. So it
Yeah.
doesn't lack credibility. It has credibility to do that. But you give up on, and so the human race is designed to offload cognitive effort because that
Got
will
it.
allow us to do more. And I think when you go think of just the psychology of consumers, and I put consumers and employees in the same place because
Mhm.
for HR and organizations, employees are like consumers.
Yeah.
um, you know we are designed to offload effort, whether it's
Got it.
physical or cognitive effort.
Yeah. That's
That's what
that's
the
a
human
really
being is
interesting point.
designed to.
Yeah.
And
That's
so if we need to take that away.
so sticking to the Google Maps analogy, right? And an example is, I think, how do you maybe advise brands on how you can create those moments of wow through that experience, right? Because I think that's the other thing. Once you kind of assume something is going to take off that cognitive load from the individual, how do you still introduce these, wow, sudden surprise moments? Things like Google Maps will suddenly tell me, hey, there's this cafe over here, or these are the kind of attractions nearby, or whatever it is. But how does that happen? How do you kind of plan for that as a marketer from a CX perspective? And therefore, maybe what would HR or managers need to do?
No, that's fair. I think the first part, Kiran, would be ownership. I
Okay.
really think it sets down to ownership, right? And
Yeah.
especially for, as you mentioned, as you were, you mentioned about onboarding, you said it's not every
Right.
it's HR's job, it's HR, it's operations,
Yeah.
it's IT. That's true. But who is owning the employee experience?
Right.
Is there somebody who the buck stops at?
Correct.
Right?
Got it.
And I don't
Yeah.
know if an organization doesn't have that, then it's a conversation that the board of that organization, if they value employees, should have.
Yeah.
Who does the buck stop at for employee experience?
Correct.
And does that individual or team, are they empowered to tell all the other teams which are creating these experiences to get their act together if they need to?
Right.
So it starts first with ownership,
Mm-hmm.
and it's easier said than done.
Yeah.
I can tell you from my experiences in the appliances business, the customer service team is like a P&L, right? So they might not agree to the fact that, hey, you can give out this piece for free. They're like, listen, I am not a cost center. I'm a profit center. I need to make money off my spares and repairs. So I'm not going to do
Right.
this.
Right.
So it's always it's a handoff. But the point is, then that's where the leadership of the organization needs to step up
Yeah.
and say, what is the value equation really that we're willing to fight for? And many times, as people who are driving the experience narrative, you need to be able to put that value up there, saying it's okay if I give a 300 rupees service free of cost on a refrigerator
Hmm.
because it's of higher value to me when they buy my microwave,
Right.
where I'll realize, say, 4,000 rupees of margin,
Yeah.
hypothetically, right? And these margins don't exist. I'm just sort of taking numbers for the sake of it.
Sure.
But so that's one. The ownership part is the first one.
Yeah.
The second one, again, it goes back to being able to capture data.
Hmm.
Because if you don't have the data, it's intuitive. Now, you could be intuitive when you have a team of 25.
Sure.
Maybe you have a team of 100 when you're being able to walk down the corridor, shake hands, look into people's eyes, have the ability to have coffee with them. Your
And yeah.
intuition can work.
Yeah.
Once you go beyond that, it's not you have to use data because
Correct.
data will give you the intuition inputs. You don't have that ability to get that one-on-one inputs anymore. So the second big point on this really is data. Do you have enough of that? Are you capturing that in a seamless way? And
Sure.
then possibly funneling it up for folks to take the right decision. I'm not expecting HR to suddenly become, leads on correlation analysis, statistics,
Sure. Sure.
and start doing pivots or huge SQL queries and so on. So somebody needs to make sure that the data is coming to them in a manner where they can interpret it and use it for making the right decisions. So
Right.
that ownership and the data part, I think, the two big pieces which determine the overall CX and
Mm.
EX journey, I would say. To your question on the aha moments,
Yeah.
always break the aha moments in two.
Okay.
There is an aha moment which is when there is criticality, and that's the easier one,
Sure.
right? And
Sure.
then there's an aha moment when there is no criticality.
Hmm.
Let me talk about the first one. The criticality ones are always easier. Unfortunately, they are the ones where we don't seem to be, focused most on for I don't know what reason. Again, I'll give you an example of a typical employee experience. Let's say with the insurance help desk.
Yeah.
Your employee is at a hospital, either taking care of himself or somebody in their family, and you've got this great medical cover going, fantastic, right?
Hmm.
They need a cover increase. They need possibly a quick approval.
Yeah.
The TPA and the insurance desk are going back and forth, and the poor employee at that stage, rather than look after their family, is going through enduring this
Correct.
entire administrative overhead.
Correct.
Now, what does it take for you to be at that moment to make sure that there is something that allows for that experience to be a great experience?
Hmm.
So when people are at critical points and consumers are at critical points, they are vulnerable.
Right.
And when people are vulnerable at that time, if you stand up as being somebody who's an ally or an assistive force that is there with them,
Hmm.
you can get to a moment of delight very, very easily because they
Yeah.
are vulnerable at that stage.
Correct.
But
Correct.
we don't often do that because we
Yeah.
think of
Yeah.
these as edge cases. We don't realize the edge cases end up making a
A
huge
big
amount of,
difference. Yeah.
yes, the mark, the perceptual mark, and this is what I said, the current experience leading to the future perception and actions. These
Right.
are huge elements over there.
Yeah.
So how do
Absolutely.
you stand up at those moments and to be able to therefore identify these critical break moments in your
Hmm.
consumer's life cycle, in your employee's life cycle, are great ways to possibly think of things.
Yeah. Yeah.
The other one is, to your point, the other aha moments, like you said, you suddenly got a cafe notification while
Yeah.
you're taking a drive, right?
Yeah.
Now, those are predictable. When you use prediction, it could be a cafe for you. It could be an amusement park for someone else.
Correct. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
To send a cafe to somebody who wants an amusement park, or to send you an amusement park if you were looking for a cafe, is not delight,
Yeah.
right? That it's just like, hey, they're trying to
Right.
spam me. Suddenly
Yeah.
move from delight
Exactly.
to spam, right? And
Yeah.
it's a very
Fine
easy
line.
jump. And
Yeah.
it's also a very easy jump. It takes, like, again, in our times, it's an instantaneous move, right?
Right.
You will take that snap decision about that product being spammy
Yeah.
in that fraction of a second. You will not deliberate about it.
Correct.
Damn, why are you showing me amusement park? I don't go to amusement parks. I don't have kids. What's wrong
Yeah.
with them? They're just so spamming. Boom,
Yeah.
out. Your
Yeah.
perception's formed, right? And
Yeah.
it's taken
Turn
barely a
off
fraction of a second.
notifications immediately and
Yes,
everything happens. Yeah.
absolutely. So the predictability now to create aha moments, again, that is even more dependent on data. I would say the
Mhm.
first part of it, which is critical moments, because they're not too many, I would say people could be a lot more insightful about their their audiences and still find
Sure.
ways of creating those aha moments there.
Sure.
But predictability is going to be very, very tough. That does require data,
Yeah.
right? And you have to know that what is predictable for you, because you doing this in a scale structure manner, has to be unpredictable for someone else.
Correct.
It
Yeah.
can't be a employee policy that we will send you a beautiful hamper which has diapers, food, baby food, etc. when the kid is born. Then it's no longer a predict. Then it's no longer delight. But
Correct.
if it's happening and you are doing that, then that's a moment of delight.
Yeah.
But are you predictable? Have you predicted enough? Do you know that there's a paternity leave that's in the waiting, or do you know there's a maternity leave in the waiting? There is there's an insurance help desk call, check that's been done on maybe say maternity benefits, etc. And these are all data points that need to sit somewhere, and they do sit somewhere today.
Yeah.
With
Absolutely.
most large organizations, there are tickets that are raised to HR, right? Even HR follows
Right.
a ticketing system. You can't just, the old days of walking into an office and saying, hey, I need to have a discussion are
Exactly.
over.
Yeah.
And in today's world with remote and hybrid work, that's even more ticketing oriented, right?
Yeah.
So the tickets exist, but does the ticket which goes to, say, people operations or HR operations talk to the ticket which has gone to the insurance help desk,
Yeah.
or has the ability somewhere for a manager who might be really, really close? And in this case, I think managers need to be considered as both experienced deliverers
Hmm.
as well as data
Yes.
gatherers,
Yeah.
right?
Exactly. Yeah.
So and that information is all of those three information pieces coming together to make sure that either this happens at an organization level, or
Hmm.
the organization structurally triggers a notification to a manager to get this done.
Yeah.
There will be various ways of delivering. So that goes back to my point of the product has been designed, which is we will send a care basket when somebody's got a birth in their family.
Correct.
The delivery of that can be through manager, through team, centrally, and all of that. Right? That's just a
Ex-
delivery mechanism. But to reach that state is what can define delight. But there should not be a policy. If
Yeah.
it's a
Exactly.
policy, there's no delight to it. Then it's an expectation.
And again, if you fail over there, that's even worse
Yeah,
because then
that's even
you
worse.
are not even
Because hey,
meeting
I remember, you used to
expectations.
send these care hampers. What happened?
Absolutely, absolutely. So I think to kind of round up this discussion, right? I think I have probably one or two last kind of questions, or would love to kind of get your comments. Is from the perspective of an EX, and as again a people leader and a CX leader, I think you have that you know great combination. Um, how does a company get started? What are the basic kind of foundational things that need to be set in place, even from just a manager perspective? There could be a ton of data. We've been talking a lot about data, but unfortunately, too much data also has a completely negative sort of ROI to it. So, as a marketer as well, I'm sure you have tons of data points coming in, but what are those few things that you distill it down to make sure you have a complete understanding of what's happening and provide that service?
Yeah, I think if I understand correctly, what you're asking for, Kiran, is that you could have multiple sources of data. How do you sort of get that into a manner where you can consume it and then
Yeah,
get
and make
insights
sense
out
of
of
it
it?
and do something with it, right? Because again, you might have 50 data points from your CRM system, you'll have 75 data points from your digital marketing systems, you'll have something from after sales. So how do you kind of bring all of that down, and how do you get started in understanding what's the most important ones that you need to probably?
I think there are two approaches to this. One, I think in the field of marketing, because there is cash flow that exists, and
Yep.
marketers like to doing creative things versus do cognitive effort on numbers. You talk about negative ROI. See, that was all about cognitive effort. You actually
Right.
put data which is positive into negative ROI because of the cognitive effort behind analyzing data.
Yeah,
So I
yeah.
think there's a lot of marketing automation solutions that are available nowadays, which try and bring these disparate sources of data together and then
Okay.
are able to present to you a certain amount of, you know, I would say trend line data or correlational elements, which can start helping you make the larger insights that you want to take, to which you need
Yeah.
to help you take decisions. So those marketing automation softwares are a great place. Now, this did not happen 10, 15 years ago. You know,
Right.
then 10, 15 years ago, you basically had different data sources coming. There was a, you know, a deck with an Excel sheet that might come from a Nielsen.
Yeah.
You might have another one that might come from your customer service team. There
Right.
would be a third one that would come from your, you know, your sales networks. And so as a marketing leader, you'd have to try and make sense of this. And your best recourse at that time was to have an analyst in your team.
Right. Exactly.
And my starting point for any somebody, if those solutions don't exist, they don't have access to them, my starting point with them is to get an analyst in your team, because you don't want to go to your point of say negative ROI, right? To have so
Yeah.
much cognitive effort that you're like, listen, I'm not going to look at data. Let me just take my own decision. I
Correct.
think a Christmas gift is all that people need to have a delight. Let me just make sure they get a Christmas gift. That's my intuition. I don't care about the data. It's too painful to get into data. Uh, you know, that's
Yeah.
an, I would not say, a very safe space to operate in for too long. Might be for one season. I don't know if the second season will be there or not. So I think that for me, that's the starting point. Just make sure that
Yeah.
there's somebody who can make sense out of data for you. But it's an ideal place situation to get to a more streamlined enterprise, you know, software solution which exists, which can do this.
Got it.
And for those solutions, I think considering the space is not very standardized today, uh, I think the interoperability with multiple different systems from which the data needs to get, data pipes need to be laid and need to be funneled in, that needs to be there. I
Yeah.
think the the good part and the easy part for somebody designing this, and you know that's obviously folks like you, is that uh, the the data points, the classification of data points will be very similar.
Yeah.
You know, it might be insurance, travel, you know,
Correct.
stuff like this.
Correct.
The unfortunately, the data pipes might be very disparate. A pipe
Correct.
from an Amex versus a pipe from, say, Max Insurance versus an Apollo Insurance. There could be completely disparate data pipes,
Yeah.
and you need to write the, you know, the joining engines over there better.
Yeah.
But I think bringing all of that together is important. Now, somewhere in this entire thing, I think each organization, possibly with help from people who I often see, are the ones who are creating these, I would say, you know, softwares and operating sort of
Hmm.
platforms, have
Yeah.
to also draw a fine line between the privacy of the individual versus the
Correct.
data that they bring,
Correct.
right?
Yeah.
And at
Yeah.
what stage does it move from being good to being stocky,
Correct. Big
right,
brother.
and
Brother way.
invasive?
Yeah.
And very often, because the extent and the depth of the data that exists, to a person who's just reviewing the output trend line graphs and the broad headlines, they might not understand where the data was sourced from, under what conditions, under
Mhm.
what, you know, so-called guidelines, and under what consent, and
Yeah.
how it's got funneled back before it's being presented to them in these sweet little
Correct.
insight buckets, right?
Correct.
So that in knowledge typically exists with the people who are creating these platforms.
Hmm.
And I think it's a responsibility for them to co-educate
Yep.
the users as to when there's a fine line between, you know, doing knowing your employee better versus becoming invasive in their privacy space.
Yeah. Fine line between useful and abusive, right? And abusing the
Yes,
data that you have as well. Yeah.
absolutely.
So I think Guneet, my final question then is, as a people leader, what are some of the data points you wish you had, which would really help you probably deliver a better experience for your teams?
I like again I said, right. The frame changes dramatically when you're a direct people leader or you're a manager of managers sort of
Sure. Sure.
role, right?
Yeah.
And I would say if somebody new is joining, I'd really love to know a lot more about them.
Yep.
Then try to figure it out in my 1 half an hour, which I might have with
Correct.
them the first quarter,
Yeah.
and then I'm possibly might meet them the second quarter, right?
Right.
And that for me, you know, is possibly creating a really poor experience. So I'd love
Yeah.
to know more about that person
More
intuitively,
contextual data
more
about them.
context, so that my first
Yeah,
conversation with them can be a lot more richer versus just
right.
doing the figuring out. Because I don't have a follow-up conversation next week or next month. It's possibly the next quarter.
Correct. Correct.
Therefore, if I'm losing that much time, by that time, in 3 months, that person has formed an experience. My ability
Yeah.
to help them create a better experience in my team becomes massively reduced versus
Right.
if I was able to make the first 30 minutes or 45 minutes that I'm spending with them more enriching.
Yeah.
That's I think that's possibly one space.
Hmm.
Um, the second, I'd love to know, for example, where my employees are feeling frustrated.
Yep. Okay.
And very often, and when it comes to people policies, the frustration gets doesn't get communicated because people are either scared or people don't have the right avenue to share that frustration. They also at times think that the people managers are not necessarily equipped to handle it. It's generally a company policy,
Right.
but those frustrations need to be able to come through, not
Yeah.
at a sentiment level, which many employee surveys do,
Sure.
but
Sure.
at an incident level,
Yeah.
because you don't solve, incidents define the sentiment,
Correct.
right?
Exactly. Exactly.
And sentiment level surveys happen across, right? Most
Yeah.
companies run this depending on, their policies and their
Sure.
patterns. They might do it quarterly, yearly, half yearly, but those are often sentiment level analysis. It'll be good for us to know the incident level as to what's creating that.
Yeah.
Now, because what can happen is there is a level of empowerment for managers to be able to help ease that out till the time the policy becomes appropriate, if it's a
Sure.
challenging policy, right? And most managers in many organizations will have the ability to help create a bit of an ease or
Correct.
context around that and make the employee experience better.
Yeah.
But the only way today one would get to know about it is an escalation from the employee, which is
Correct.
now possibly the fag end of their poor experience because they've
Yeah.
resorted to an escalation point and talking to you.
Yeah. Completely
There is,
frustrated
yeah,
and final straw kind of like, yeah.
yeah. It's like, if I was to draw an experience again to automobiles, right? With all some of the new automobiles that we have now, they have these onboard monitoring systems.
Yep.
Like they're monitoring your car and all its vitals all the time.
Yep.
And if they realize that you're going to be going in for, let's say, a fuel pump issue, they might start warning you up enough, and they might actually give a call to the customer. They might send
Correct.
a notification to the customer care, who might call you and say, guys, please come into a dealership because we think you might get into a problem and let us solve for it. When we're sorry,
Correct.
this is a problem, maybe we'll exchange it for free or whatever. Versus I'm stranded on the end of the road and I'm calling the helpline
Yep.
and saying, please come rescue me. And
Yep.
that's really the state of, when an employee has possibly reached out to you and said, listen, I'm frustrated. Uh, I'm standing at the side of the road with no help. Please evacuate me. Or
Okay.
you're catching it up front earlier and saying, hey, this is possibly what you could be headed into. Let me try and see if we can find a solution beforehand.
Right, right. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, that's super useful because yeah, as you said, more often than not, it's always a postmortem that kind of comes in from a quantitative analysis perspective or sentiment analysis and those kind of things.
Yeah, we often end up being very reactive.
Correct. Yeah.
The point is delight will always come from, generally most times will be being coming from proactive, and proactiveness will come from prediction,
Correct.
and
Correct.
prediction generally comes from historical data
Yeah.
but seen in the context of future occurrence.
Yeah. Exactly. Oh, that's a very powerful way to perhaps kind of round this up. But again, I would love to kind of thank you once again for your time. I think this is super useful. As I said, I think your learnings from a CX perspective are really powerful to kind of take and try and bring into the EX world as well, right? Because, like you said, I think what we're also seeing is that there are the new breed of people coming into the workplace, coming into being the consumers of today. They expect that sort of proactive, personalized experience. Impatience is a huge problem across the board. So there's a lot of learning that we can take from the CX perspective. And so for that, Guneet, thank you so much for spending time with us and sharing your wisdom.
Oh, thank you so much. I when you told me about this, I recall one of the first, I would say, management books I'd read in my lifetime. I don't even remember too much of the author, etc. But I remember it was a book which said that you can't put a smile on your customers' faces till the time your employees are smiling.
Oh wow.
And
Okay.
if I think of it in today's world, which is hyper competitive in almost every
Yeah.
segment,
Yeah.
you need employees who are up there ready to put their heart and soul to make your company successful.
Correct.
uh, and they won't do that unless until they're happy and you're
Yeah.
taking care of them.
Yeah.
And so if it goes back to that, it could have been maybe that book 20 years ago was written for a hotel. But I think considering the competition levels that we have today in the industry, I think it's relevant for every industry.
Absolutely.
If employees are not happy, they're not going to be in a position to make your customers happy.
Yeah, absolutely. No, on that note, thank you. Thank you again, Guneet, and have a great day ahead.